All right, y'all. So we're now going to go to the second part of part two, and we're going to be focusing on the protest movement and the government reactions. Up to this point, we've seen the creation of apartheid, or from 1948 to 1955. Really, a strong case can be made that apartheid became the constitutional aspect of society. But let's look at the protests. 1950s protest movements began with the two key leaders. Albert Lutuli. Albert Lutuli was the president of the ANC, and he represented the traditional values. In some ways, lack for a better term for you guys, you would consider him a boomer. He is feared a shift to radicalness. He believed that would defeat the movement as the government would overreact, and he wanted to continue those negotiations. But clearly, up to this point, the negotiations have failed to really achieve anything. And this is when we get Nelson Mandela. Now, Nelson Mandela is a younger leader, a little bit younger, just a few years younger, but he is a guy who is a leader of the Congress Youth League with the CYL. He is one that wants to shift to large scale protest, become kind of what we might call a militant nonviolent movement. A militant nonviolent is we're going to see the idea that it's going to go be in your face, assertive, challenging the government, increasing the number of arrests, hoping to bring more attention globally and locally to their cause. And by 1952, the Congress Youth League absolutely wins out. They compel the ANC to do a 1952 mass protest that covered the entire country over unfair laws directed against Africans. Probably the most significant thing they did was they would walk to the local police stations and burn their passbooks. The whole purpose of burning their passbooks was to get arrested. They were hoping that by the mass arrests, they would overwhelm the penal system so that the prisons were completely overfilled. And this is where the slogan, Nobel go to jail, began to really creep into the conversation here because, again, they wanted arrest. So the Defiance campaign is relatively successful here. Additionally, it really changed its nature from focusing on middle class propriety to the Africans in general, moving more towards to a complete racial view rather than class distinctions. Because of the success, they're going to go from 7,000 to 100,000 members as a result of the Defiance campaign. And Albert Lutuli, officially, as president of the ANC, officially endorsed the protest, really signifying a break from those traditional values. Albert Lutuli was compelled by the CYL. Well, unfortunately, despite the failure of getting any of these apartheid laws changed, the protest movement did unite. The Congress Alliance was a coalition of the ANC, SAIC, the Communist Party of South Africa, as well as other groups such as the Colored Congress League. They began to really realize instead of individually, they must unite, that intersectionality. The organization created the Congress of the People and was meant to be a romantic meeting of all the groups to really demonstrate to the South African government that the movement was united. It is during this time period that in 1955, the Freedom Charter was established. This becomes the ideological foundation for the civil rights movement. We call this Chartism. Chartism is a set of agreements from various groups that to unite. So now the People's Charter is what defines the movement. If a protest movement wants to break away from the People's Charter, they no longer will be considered part of the Congress of Alliance or the People's Congress. The three main goals was a non-racial South Africa. They wanted to remove racial distinctions and allow people to participate in government based on their merit rather than race or skin color. Focused on human rights, they believe that humans individually have dignity. And they argue the only way to progress South Africa was a redistribution of wealth. In other words, the Afrikaner lands that have been accumulated because of the systemic racism must be redistributed equally amongst the people so that all people had access to economic equality. Unfortunately, this is attached to communism. This is when this is going to be the part of the charter that the Communist Party really enforced. Of course, this is going to be the part that the South African government is going to promote internationally to demonstrate the movement is all about communism. Unfortunately, once the People's Congress established this document, as they were celebrating, there was a sense of excitement that they're about to create an agreement, a game plan, a plan of action. This is when a spy sent a signal to the police, and the police came in, raided the Congress, arresting everyone, bringing it into that. So now the only thing that they got is the charter, and that charter is going to be used as propaganda actually against the movement internationally. And this is where we see, so now we're in 1955 again. We're looking at this idea of this progress. We see the Defiance Campaign. We see the Congress of the People. So how successful was it? How many laws were overturned? Unfortunately, not only were laws not overturned, we began to see the government double down on their oppression. They increased state violence against Africans in their communities, and they passed two key oppressive laws. The Criminal Amendment Act is really important as it extended the penalty for violating laws based on intent. And all of a sudden, we begin to realize it's not the actions, it becomes the intention that becomes even more important, and it's going to extend those penalties. Plus, people are going to be guilty for association. So let me get this right. The ANC goes from 7,000 to 100,000. Well, part of the Criminal Amendment Act is the ANC is an illegal group. So any member, if their name is on a party list, they are now considered a criminal. So any of those 100,000 people's friends, families, and others that are associated with them are now found guilty. This law exponentially increased the amount of criminalized people. Very significant. We begin to see this arbitrariness within the African community. Who is guilty? Is everybody guilty based on their skin color? That becomes the issue. Additionally, they passed the Public Safety Act, which really empowered the local police. Local police had expanded their ability to declare a state of emergencies, which now all of a sudden the National Party has instituted rules to cement their power. I truly believe that by 1955, the system of apartheid has been fundamentally cemented into a constitutional order that's going to have to take a monumental movement to get rid of. And this is where we begin to see it. So instead of the protest movements getting the progress, the actual protest movements have actually created more oppression. And really the apex of this oppression prior to the Sharpeville massacre is going to be the treason trial. The South African government responded by arresting 156 South African anti-apartheid leaders who were part of the Congress of the People. The treason trial was held from 1957 to 1961, and the 156 defendants were tried for creating a communist conspiracy to overthrow the government. Using the People's Charter as a key piece of evidence, they attempted to paint all of these as communist conspirators. Clearly that's not true, but despite that, from 1957 to 1961, this trial drags on, which actually was the South African government's goal. It failed to convict anyone. It does unite the Congress alliance there. I do think the text that you're reading talks about the success, but I, as a historian, really focus on how the treason trial drained resources for the movement. The key leaders now were under house arrest, heavily monitored. They were not able to move interactively. Plus, any of the resources had to be used for their defense. So now, all of a sudden, instead of the protest movement progressing, it is actually being impeded. Really important, I think, that you understand that, because that's going to drive us right to this element. The last part of the government oppression is in 1959 that we're going to talk about in this conversation. It's going to be the promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act. Well, it sounds kind of cool that Africans are going to be able to self-govern, but in reality, this is just cementing the Native Land Act. So instead of 4 races, we now have the Black African race divided between ethnicities. If you look at the colors of this map, it shows you all of their quote-unquote homelands or Batustans in which they were relegated to. Bantu Self-Government Act also said Africans are no longer citizens. Africans were citizens of their Bantustans. So any hope of constitutional protections are now lost. So if there are Africans in those townships that we looked at, they're no longer protected by any type of South African liberty. So therefore, if they are found to be guilty of something, they're either going to go to prison or exiled to their homeland. So really, by 1952, the protest movement held only one success, and that's going to be the Alexander bus boycott. You're about to read about that at the outcome of this lecture. The protest movement had slowed as the leaders had been arrested and were going through the long, drawn-out treason trial. Instead of concessions, the national government increased oppression. Could the nonviolent protest achieve its goals? And that's the question. As we begin to go, we're going to pause here, but I do want to just emphasize at this moment, the ANC was basically at a brick wall. There was a dead end. There was no movement forward. What is going to happen? And our next part that we're going to look at is the growth of radicalness and Sharpeville. Very important elements. I hope that this makes sense.